And Holly, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Great, thanks, Catherine. I'd like to begin today's presentation by our esteemed panel of parking and planning specialists by recognizing and thanking the Transport Hartford Academy at the Center for Latino Progress, Park New Haven, and the New Haven Parking Authority, who are co-sponsors of this event. We hope you'll join many of us who are on this webinar today for the 4th annual multimodal Northeast Multimodal and Transit Summit on November 22nd. And Tony, if you're on, if you want to drop that link in the chat so people can register, that'd be great. The Connecticut legislature recently adopted Public Act 21-29, which, among other things, established a statewide cap on parking mandates. And for some reason, the slides aren't advancing. There we go. Oh, I'm sorry. I was supposed to say a few words about Desegregate Connecticut. Catherine, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So Desegregate Connecticut, we are a coalition of organizations and neighbors who see the costs of our current land use laws, and we're advocating for statewide land use reforms to improve equity, economy, and the environment. And I think you can move on to the next slide, Holly. And here is the full graphic with all of our coalition members. And then on the next slide, I think we have a little bit more details about the statewide parking reforms that just passed.
Right. Okay. Great. So this is a better place to start with the Public Act 21-29 that recently passed in Connecticut, establishing a statewide cap on parking mandates. So towns cannot require more than one space for 0 to 1 bedroom units, and 1 space for an accessory dwelling unit, accessory apartment, and 2 spaces for a 2-bedroom unit, unless the communities opt out. That's important because we currently give up a lot of our public space to car storage, as well represented by this image here that shows the relative space that a 2-bedroom apartment takes up relative to 2 parking spaces and the space required around them. And right, so communities can now, choose to opt out of these parking mandates. But it does require a vote, 2/3 vote of the legislative body and 2/3 vote of the zoning commission or combined planning and zoning commission. And we are going to today discuss why Connecticut towns should opt in to parking reform. I think I said opt out before, but obviously it's an opt-in. And I'm actually going to put a link to the act itself and its full title in the chat because it's a mouthful, and you might want to reference it later. But first, I'd like to introduce our very esteemed guests who will be speaking today. We have first up. Actually, we're going to have Marta Goldsmith speak. She is the director of the Form-Based Codes Institute, and she is going to explain the evolution of zoning, followed by Norman, who will articulate the connections between transportation, land use, and parking. And then Chris will provide solid examples of the benefits of making the necessary reforms. And I should introduce myself too. Perhaps I am Holly Parker, and as of about 4 hours ago, I am the new active transportation lead at SLR Consulting, and I'm I'm reporting here live from the New Haven office at 195 Church Street. Marta, would you like to share your screen?
Sure, I will do that now. And let me, so that I don't get totally confused, let me stop looking at your screen. And there we go. All right, now. So as you can now see, I think the correct screen, correct? Not the presenter's view?
Yes.
Okay, so to begin with, zoning, talking a little bit about zoning and why we care about zoning is zoning makes places what they are. If a place looks like this or this, it typically has conventional zoning. If it looks like these places, it has a different kind of zoning. And in these particular cases, except for the historic postcard, these places all have form-based codes. And we'll talk about the differences and why these places look very different in a minute. Zoning evolved from some trends in the US, starting back in the late 18 and early 1900s, moving into in the early 20th century. There were reasons why policymakers felt compelled to look at regulating land use. And there were trends in industrialization, urbanization, growth in population, the impact of all of that on public health, but also the emergence of urban planning and ultimately the popularization of the automobile. And all these were factors in driving an interest to regulate land use. And so in as early as 1908, Los Angeles took a first step towards systematic segregation of land uses by separating industrial and residential districts. In 1913, by 1913, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and New York also allowed cities to ban non-residential uses in areas where there were residences. And then in 1926, a landmark decision by the Supreme Court, referred to as Euclid v. Amber, and it had nothing to do with geometry. Euclid is a town in Ohio, which made the final determination at the Supreme Court level that in fact, cities could regulate the use of private property for the health and welfare of the population. And then as the car became more popular and traditional gender roles in terms of the role of women at home in the 40s and 50s, and cheap money loans for single family housing after World War II, as well as the development of the interstate highway system, all led to what we now call suburban sprawl. And you can see on the left here, in 1948, a zoning map from Hopewell, New Jersey, which is completely regulated, segregated by uses. And what we end up with is commercial strips like this, or housing developments that look like this. But there was also another trend. The zoning movement quickly advanced beyond just the isolation of residential uses to exclude apartment houses from residential areas. And it wasn't because necessarily that the policymakers or the property owners didn't want multifamily housing as much as they didn't really want the kinds of people who were living in multifamily housing to be living in single family residence. For example, Harvard University at the time, Harvard University president at the time, Charles Eliot, said that tenants were a class of nomads that had no stable footing in the town. Therefore, they felt they should be excluded from the nicer residential areas. And you can see here, of course, that a lot of this was driven as a desire to segregate not only incomes and ethnicity, but also race. And this became an accepted practice even after the Supreme Court ruled in 1917 that segregating by race was not legal. The emergence and use of private covenants became an alternative. So by the mid 20th century, our zoning developed communities like this. And you can see that industrial was segregated from commercial, and residential, even from civic uses like schools. And you can imagine the impact that this had on transportation and congestion and ultimately air pollution. If every time you wanted to go buy a pack of gum, you had to get in your car and drive to the arterial, or every day when your child was going to school, you had to drive to and from school. So, but starting in the 1970s and 80s, the market for residential and commercial development and where people wanted to live began to change. The factors that contributed to that were women in the workforce, concerns about the effects of suburban sprawl, coupled with long commutes and environmental concerns. And as a result, the desire to shorten those commutes and to address those particularly air pollution concerns resulted in federal regulations and more investments in public transit. And out of that emerged a higher appeal for mixed use and walkable communities, which is often referred to as new urbanism. So new kinds of urban code, or new kinds of zoning codes, which we call form-based codes, emerged in the mid 80s. And form-based codes were based on zones that were defined by their physical characteristics and by a mix of uses and housing types, with a focus on walkability and mobility options. So what do we mean by a form-based code? Well, a form-based code begins with a community vision. And these C adjectives are the kinds of things that a form-based code typically addresses. And you see these are defined in more detail here. But what that means in any given community is defined in the process of creating a vision plan or a comprehensive plan. And then based on that plan, a form-based code is a set of land development regulations that has predictable built results, and particularly a high quality public realm. Form-based code focuses on what happens outside the buildings or the form, and includes standards not only for private development, but also for public development. And it focuses on the spaces in between the buildings as opposed to primarily what happens in them. So how do they differ from conventional codes? While conventional code focuses on density, and you can see these two parcels actually have the same density, but with very different built results, form-based codes focus on building forms. Conventional codes tend to ignore what streetscapes look like, whereas form-based codes are very detailed on sidewalks and lane widths and bicycle lanes and other things that create the spaces, the rooms between the buildings. Conventional zoning tends to have very little detail about what happens in the public realm, whereas form-based codes provide considerable detail. Form-based codes are conventional. Conventional zoning is primarily text, whereas form-based codes include a lot of tables and graphics and images to convey what they're looking for. Form-based conventional codes focus on very specific uses such as these, whereas form-based codes, as I said, focus more on the form of buildings and the streets. Form-based codes do address uses, but in much more general terms typically. And also conventional zoning relies more on the discretionary project review and approval process, whereas form-based codes have clear standards which, if a developer follows them, they can build by right. So in summary, conventional codes emphasize primarily use and density in the permit process. Form-based codes also include use and density in the permit process, but they're much more focused on the form of the buildings, the placements, the quality of the public's open space. So there are two areas, I think, which may be of particular interest to communities in Connecticut, where form-based codes really fit with some of the current priorities in the state. One is encouraging housing diversity. And you can see this image from Opticos referring to what's become known as missing middle housing, where form-based codes really encourage housing diversity, which also results in a diversity of price points and incorporates more affordability. And also form-based codes, many communities many states are adopting legislation to directly address the affordability crisis in housing in their states. And either encouraging or requiring communities to allow for higher density, particularly near jobs and transportation options. What is not always included, however, is an emphasis on what that multifamily or higher density looks like. And so here are some examples drawn by DPZ co-design of what those places can look like. And these are all part of standards that can be included in a form-based code. With regard to parking reform, form-based codes have a particularly heavy emphasis on activating the ground floors of structured parking, off-street parking, but also doing what I call empowering on-street parking, so that you can see in these particular images that on-street parking is used to shape the public environment. And then also, as your recent legislation has done, form-based codes frequently call for the elimination or reduction of parking minimums. And in some instances, and I know Chris can talk more about this, adopt parking maximums even. And then the other thing that form-based codes do, which is directly related to the amount of parking you need, is to ensure access to other mobility options. As you can see on the right, transit and walking and cycling are all considered and encouraged through form-based codes. And so zoning really does create a framework for meeting these other priorities. So that's just kind of an overview and a very quick walk through the history of US zoning. And if you're interested in form-based codes, here are a couple of resources. There is the primer, the basic primer in form-based codes, a guide for planners, urban designers, municipalities, and developers by Dan and Karen Perolik and Paul Crawford. And then on the FBCI website, you can download form-based codes, a step-by-step guide for communities. And here are our social media handles and our websites. And on that, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Marta. That was a really great background and a great context for Norman to take over from and to give us some words on his research on the development of parking in Connecticut cities and the implications of historical choices on cities today. And Dr. Garrick is Professor Emeritus of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UConn, and we are honored to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you, Marta. I think that was really great as a lead into my presentation, because sometimes we think about parking as if it's isolated from other things, but obviously it's part of a system of how we conceive, build places, but also the type of transportation systems that we favor. And that's really an important part of what has come out of our research over the years. So I wanted to start this presentation by talking about a little bit about our research, which goes back as far as 2003. And these were three of our my students, Craig, Sylvie, and Jian Hong. on one of the first trips where we developed a lot of the procedures that we used subsequently over the next 20 years, including just being in the field, counting, mapping, etc. This is work that was then continued by Chris McKay, who will address us in a few minutes, and Neil Olinsky, who I see is also attending the presentation. So some of the first work we did was to look at smaller cities in New England, including West Hartford, this is Somerset Square in Glastonbury. This is, I believe, Northampton. But then we also transitioned after that initial work to looking at bigger cities such as Hartford, Bridgeport, and beyond the border of Connecticut, looking at places that have actually started the moving away from conventional approaches to parking, places like Cambridge, Arlington, and Berkeley, California. So what did we find out? Well, in all our research, I think we can summarize what we were doing in parking by just 2 lines. And I refer to them as fables because they are things that we believe that are not true. And the first is that more is better. So our policies are based on the idea that we need to have enough parking or else something is going to happen. It's never quite clear what that something is, but a lot of our policy is based on this idea. And the second fable is that cost is no objection, no object. And by cost, I'm talking about what we pay to bill for parking, the cost of the fatalities because parking facilitates more and more driving, the cost of the pollution, the cost of carbon emission, all of those things are never taken into account in terms of how we plan parking, the policies we have developed for parking, and the policies thankfully we have started to move away from, but was very much in vogue 20 years ago when we started this thing. So to illustrate some of these points, more is better, cost is no object. I'll start with the very first study we did, which looked at 6 sites around New England, 3 that we considered traditional sites. And thankfully, Martha has just explained what those sites look like. They have the form and function of those form-based code places. So West Hartford Center, Northampton, and Brattleboro, and compared them to Avon Center, Glastonbury Center, and Somerset Square in Glastonbury, which was built, I believe, in the 60s or 70s. So one of the things we found here is that looking at the 2 different types of site, the traditional site versus the contemporary, some more farm-based sites versus contemporary site, we found that the peak occupancy rate was about 1 space per 1,000 square foot in the traditional site, and about double that in the more contemporary site. So these non-form-based code places were using twice as much parking. But what was interesting and what maybe was a surprise to us was to find that the parking required by zoning was almost identical in both places. So in other words, in West Hartford and Brattleboro and Northampton, they were requiring almost 5 times as much parking as they were actually using during the peak time. In the more suburban type locations, they were requiring maybe 2.5 times more parking. So when we're talking about parking reform, the very lowest hanging fruit is to get rid of these parking requirements. Because in essence, what we found was that towns were forcing developers to provide 2 to 3 times more parking than was being used during Thanksgiving weekend. you think about the implication of that from the point of view of water runoff, from the point of view of waste of land, the cost of that land. This is a no-brainer that we need, and this is where the legislature for desegregating Connecticut comes into play. It's really, this is the low-hanging fruit that we all need to address. But moving on, from the point of view of share economics, what we found was that the amount of people on site at the traditional site was more than 3 times more than those on the contemporary site. And again, we think about this. We plan for cars, but cars do not spend money. What we're finding is that in places that are built in using the form-based code approach, or the traditional approach we see in West Hartford, for example, we see 3 times as many people on foot, and they got there either by walking or by transit, or also by higher vehicle occupancy. So what we have been doing with contemporary building is really building for cars, but cars are not spending money. And this is another reason why we need to rethink how we are doing parking in this state. This is Chris's work. So really building on that earlier study, and what this was to look at the evolution of parking in Hartford. And this is from 1957, and you can see an awful lot of parking. No parking garages. I believe there were 3 parking garages in the city at the time, but lots of surface parking. This is 1957. This is what the city more looks like today. This was from 2009, but it hasn't changed as much. And one of the things that I want you to contemplate on is the change, what the changes that have accompanied this increase in parking. So one of the arguments about parking is that it's done for economic development. This is the economic development that has accompanied this change in parking in Hartford. So in 1957, there were 16,000 parking spaces, triple the number in 2009. The population of the city was 108,000 people. It's now 1/3 less, 120,000 people. Jobs, no changes in jobs. In 1957, there were at least 4 major department stores. Now there are none. So the whole point of this is to show that what we have done is switched from a place with a lot of parking to one where parking almost comes to dominate the landscape. So we have lost the vibrancy of the city. And Chris has actually gone on to show a relationship between the amount of parking and the amount of driving that gets done. This is Bridgeport, a very similar story. We'll go back even further, 1913. Bridgeport, 1954, doesn't look very different. Bridgeport, 2013. And if we, a totally different place, a place where 60% of the area, the floor area in the city is occupied either by parked cars, or sorry, are put aside for parked cars, usually they're not occupied, or is used for the highways and roads, 60%. I think that's very close to the worst that you can find in the country. So Bridgeport, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the 15-minute city. In 1913, we certainly had a 15-minute city in Bridgeport, but that was not the case. Now we have destroyed that 15-minute city. And just to illustrate what that means, the amount of commerce actually decreased, even though we went from 6-story buildings to skyscrapers. The amount of industry disappeared essentially, and the amount of residents also essentially disappeared. So again, look at those two bars. This is the amount of activity that existed in the city in 1913. This is what we have left. What we have done is hollowed out the city. We have hollowed out its tax base, and it's no surprise that this city is very close to, has been very close to bankruptcy in the near past. So, but this is still going on. This is a headline I came back to on Monday of last week, which says that, which is celebrated in my local newspaper, the opening of a new parking garage in, of all places, Willimantic, Connecticut. Willimantic is a place I love, is a place I go to the co-op, to Stone Row for the best restaurant in Eastern Connecticut, to the fish market. It's a really great place. But yet, for the last 15 years, we have been told that what is going to save Willimantic is this garage that we finally got. So let's look at some of the numbers. This is what this monstrosity, a block-long monstrosity in Willimantic looks like. It's 251 spaces that is going to save Willimantic. $13 million. And just to put that in context, the general budget for Wyndham is just $16 million each year. The annual budget for the Willie bus is $2 million. Think about putting that money into improving bus service in Willimantic, and think about what an impact that could have on the fate and on the face of Willimantic. And then the last point I want to make is that we never think about the cost of each of these spaces. $52,000 per space in Willimantic. So this is still going on, and we need to somehow get to a point where we understand that a parking garage is not economic development. And so I want to finish with these, what I would put forward as 6 points for effective parking management. Firstly, we need to understand what the numbers are telling us. And this is what we have tried to do with our research. Secondly, a lot of people are here, but this is just the start. Eliminate minimum parking requirements. I would say the third point is optimize the use of available parking, shared parking, lots of ways that we can optimize parking. We see that in places like West Hartford. We don't see it in places like Avon. Recognize that free parking is not, absolutely not a thing. We need to just get rid of that term in our vocabulary. The fifth point, which is a little harder, is to stop favor driving over other means of transportation. And lastly, we need to provide additional funding for sustainable travel. So that's the lessons that I've gleaned from our 20 years of research. So thanks very much, and I look forward to what Chris has to say.
Thank you, Norman. That was some pretty serious food for thought. Could you share those statistics, well, your tools in particular in the chat, those last 6 points you made? I think those are very important. And even though this is being recorded, it would be great to give people something to get out there and use. And just a clarifying question from the chat. David asked if you are claiming that there are 47,000 spaces in the downtown central business district or in the entire city.
In the downtown central business district, and I think that's an undercount because we didn't get to the parking that is underground that we couldn't see. It's definitely an undercount.
Wow. Okay. Well, Chris, you are the managing director of the State Smart Transportation Initiative, which is also a program of Smart Growth America, and which is dedicated to advancing environmental and equitable transportation policies. And we're really thrilled to have you addressing the national trends in parking research and policy.
Thanks, Holly.
Following on Norman's great
Yeah,
intro.
and thanks everyone who's joining us today. Yeah, I wanted to talk just really briefly in the time we have left about moving from parking requirements to demand management. And really, I think what I'm hitting on is just punctuating most of what Marta and Norman already said. Let's see here. So for starters, just it's worth reemphasizing that we have tons of parking in this country. By some estimates, 10 parking spaces for every household. And as Norman mentioned, we don't really have a lot of great data on how much parking there is and how much it's being used, right? We'd have to send people out to actually count this stuff and understand it. But there are a handful of studies out there that you can draw from that tell the same story over and over again, right? There's residential parking studies in Boston, Chicago, Madison, Seattle, DC, that all show us that residential parking is about 2/3 utilized wherever you go. There's a handful of downtown parking studies across the US that tell us that downtown parking is only about 52% used on average, and that's fairly consistent. And even in places where there was a parking study because of a perceived shortage, we find that the parking spaces are only about 59% full. And that really sort of indicates that what we have in these cases is not a parking shortage problem. There's often plentiful parking. What we have is a demand management problem where parking is not used efficiently, it's hard to find, it's inconvenient. And so really addressing what we think of as parking issues is really about something much different than just providing more parking. That's what leads a lot of cities to put parking minimum parking requirements in place as like the de facto tool to solve all our parking problems. And I know we like to think that there's a lot of data and science behind them. That's not really the case. There is better data these days. What you're seeing here is parking demand counts at office buildings from the most recent parking generation manual from ITE. And so you see there's good data here, good useful data about how parking demand relates to the size of buildings. But you dig in closer and you just look at this cluster of 6 or 8 office buildings, all around 300,000 square feet. And the parking that they use ranges from 500 spaces to more than 1,000 square spaces. You know, so that's double the amount at one office building versus the other. So that's part of what creates it so hard for us to set good minimum parking requirements. And this is even when we have decent data. You can see the average of all these studies is 2.4 per 1,000 square feet. And we end up with parking requirements like 3 to 5 per 1,000 square feet. So as Norman indicated, we're in lieu of any better information, we just set parking requirements much higher than what we need, thinking that the worst problem we could have is not having enough parking. And that's what leaves us with all this underused parking and empty space. That's when we have good data. Think about something like a coffee shop where we have even more sparse data and even more variation. You can see 5 coffee shops shown here. One needs 10 spots, the other needs almost 30. So obviously 3 times as much as another one. And it's just nearly impossible to codify this stuff because we don't know how successful a coffee shop's gonna be, whether people are gonna sit around on their laptops all day, right? So again, we just aim high and hope that it solves all our problems. As Marta mentioned, lots of cities are recognizing this and losing their parking requirements. You see places like Buffalo, Hartford, Minneapolis more recently, just opted to get rid of their minimum requirements entirely. But many more cities are lowering them or at least getting rid of them in parts of the city, like the downtown or near transit stations. So for the reasons that you just heard, this is probably a good movement we see happening. But one of the things about this is when cities get rid of their minimum parking requirements, one of the realities is that they're giving up a key leverage point with developers, right? Often parking requirements are an asset that the city can ask developers to provide, and it provides a point of negotiation. So what are cities getting in return for getting rid of these requirements? Well, as Norman mentioned, we're obviously going to get lower development and housing costs. We're seeing these parking garages come up all over the place that are costing $50,000 per space to build. Those costs get passed on to tenants and customers, right? So a bunch of studies looking at housing all sort of tell the same story, that about 10 to 20% of housing costs go to parking. So you can imagine someone renting. That means they're throwing $150 to $200 a month at parking that's just built into their rent, whether they need the parking space or not. So as we're looking for affordable housing and affordable rents, looking at cutting back that parking is going to be a key part of that. Also more development opportunities. So the picture here is in Collinsville, Connecticut, which is in my hometown. And if you've been there, it's an old factory village with all these great big old factory buildings. And you can imagine a developer trying to come along and convert those into apartments or coffee shops or a bike shop or whatever it might be, and trying to meet parking requirements on the order of 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet or more than that. It just makes these projects impossible to achieve. Meanwhile, you've got LaSalle Market here, which is a cafe, deli, pizza shop with really no dedicated parking. It's just on-street parking in a small shared lot. So as Marta said, we want our codes to reflect the built environment that we want, and getting rid of parking requirements or lowering them gets us there. And lastly, and just something I wanted to spend a little more time on, is we get transportation demand management. So here in Collinsville, there is some parking. It's a sort of a quasi-paved lot, shared lot, that folks tend to cram as much parking into as they can. And that meets most of the needs here. There's on-street parking too. So you have folks that figure out how to work with what parking's there, but then you have a bunch of other folks that end up walking and biking. And if there was good transit service here, they'd take transit too. And that's because when parking becomes tight, it forces folks to actually think about what their options are and think about if they have other ways of getting where they need to get. And that's how you get these multimodal outcomes that we talk about wanting and so often can't achieve because we lean so heavily on providing parking in excess of what we actually need. So the last point I wanted to make was this whole idea of travel demand management. This is actually something that cities are starting to move towards instead of just parking requirements. So cities can formalize TDM programs to get balanced parking and transportation solutions. What this means is not just asking developers to provide exorbitant amounts of parking, but actually asking them to provide less parking and think about things like bike and pedestrian investments. Think about things like providing information about the available transportation options, even things like on-site childcare, all things that help reduce people's need to drive, encourage fewer folks to drive, and achieve more multimodal outcomes. And even when it comes to parking, starting to require developers to think about things like unbundling parking. So renting out parking separately from lease agreements for building space, so that folks can choose whether they want the parking attached to their apartment or whether they don't need it at all. Things like parking cash out, so letting employees get a cash incentive if they don't need the parking that their employer offers, right? So what programs like this are doing, and you're seeing the one in San Francisco, is creating a menu of options for developers to choose from instead of just giving a one-size-fits-all solution. It's great for the cities because you still get something out of development, you still maintain some of that leverage, and you help accomplish some of your transportation related goals. It's great for developers because it builds in some flexibility. And hopefully it's great for the residents because it shows them that there's going to be a bunch of work gone into making sure that if a developer cuts back on parking, it's not going to create a bunch of related issues, and the neighborhood's going to get something else out of it. So, programs like this in San Francisco, you see similar programs in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and now popping up all across California in most cities and towns because of a state law there. So I can just point folks to a guide that we pulled out called Modernizing Mitigation that outlines this. But I think with that, I will turn it over to questions and see what we can answer about this stuff.
Thanks so much, Chris. really appreciate that. And I'm sorry, I couldn't see all of the detail in that last slide because I haven't got my new screen set up yet. I'm looking at a very small laptop screen, but I was wondering if pricing of parking was on that list as a TDM, a transportation demand management measure. We certainly have some people on this call who can speak to that. Doug Housleyden. The need for, we've seen that there's certainly plenty of parking out there already, right? If we were to price it the right way, would that have a significant impact?
Yeah,
on
and
how people-
the tools that are outlined in these kinds of programs, they present all kinds of ways of sort of surfacing the cost of parking. Like I said, whether it's asking folks to pay separately for parking from their apartment, right? And just sort of pass the cost directly on to folks, giving cash back if they don't want the parking, that's another way. And then, yeah, having folks just charging directly for parking use.
I would like to add to that to say that there are really some good practice approaches in the Hartford area. We can just look at Travelers and to a lesser extent Aetna, but also if we compare how the city of West Hartford treat pricing of parking compared to the city of Hartford, and the outcome in West Hartford is so much better in every way than in Hartford. So there is a lot that can be learned from looking at best practice in the region.
Thank you. Yeah, and appreciate the point that Hartford is in the middle of doing a new parking study at the moment. It's going to be really interesting to see now that jump between parking in 2013 and parking in 2021, the amount of it and land use impacts. I think we just got another question come in, so.
I could answer that question, Holly, if you want.
Oh,
It's a good question. I would have liked to spend more time on this, but so it's on the notion that that inadequate parking causes issues with residents, and this is exactly what I was trying to allude to, although I maybe didn't do a great job. But often, if a developer comes in and proposes not building what's seen as enough parking, then you see the nearby residents and businesses push back on the idea that, well, then it's going to overflow onto the nearby streets or flow into other parking lots nearby. And so I think a good TDM program can partially address this by making sure that developers are doing everything they can to give folks travel options in areas where they're available. So making sure that folks know what other transportation options there are, subsidizing transit passes if they're in transit areas, and all those things can help, prevent the overflow parking issues that you might get otherwise. But there's a good point here, which is that there's other programs that probably need to be put in place to address some of these issues in a lot of places. So for example, if you don't have, and this is something that we're working through here in Madison, Wisconsin now, that if you're starting to ask developers to build less parking, but you don't have proper regulation of the nearby on-street parking, it's free, it's unregulated, or it's underpriced, then you probably will see those overflow issues. So you need to think about your whole parking system at once and make sure that you're regulating the right on-street parking the right way, that private parking is shared when it can be, and sort of everything you can to make sure that those issues don't come up.
That's a great point about shared parking. I'm still thinking about Marta's comment about how, or her slide that showed that there was a designation for how much parking is required if you sell chinchillas. I mean, it seems, and it is, according to Donald Shoup and all of you who know about this, somewhat random how these requirements come about, and certainly can have a massive impact on economic development, right? in your example, Chris, some cafes could have a certain amount of parking and some could have another amount of parking that could certainly affect their business. I think of everything through the lens of transportation, and I'm curious about the fact that in Connecticut in particular, we have a lot of communities that aren't well served by transit and aren't necessarily walkable. That there's discontinuous sidewalk. Kate Rattan is or was on this call, and she knows that some of her communities don't have any sidewalk. For example, draw, maybe if someone would, maybe Marta could draw the line for us between form-based code having an impact also on that infrastructure for transit and walking, that encourages people to need less parking, to not have a car or to not use it.
Well, I think it's Smart Growth America was founded on the principle that land use and transportation are inextricably linked, and that if you are in fact going to encourage the use of and provide mobility options beyond single occupancy vehicles, whether it's biking or walking or public transit or some combination of all of these, that the land uses need to support that access to and enhancement of those mobility options. So it's fine to put in a sidewalk, but if you have to walk, if that sidewalk has multiple curb cuts to allow people to pull and park in front of a building that's been set back enough to allow for parking in front of the building, then people are not going to take advantage of the opportunity to walk. If you put in bike lanes, but they suddenly stop and the traffic, the car has precedent, then people are not going to use their bikes. And it's the same thing with transit-oriented development, that if your transit is surrounded, your transit stations are surrounded by a sea of parking, so people can drive and park there to get on the transit system, then that's not really going to support the use of that transit system or to minimize the use of the car. So it really has to be a balance of thinking how transportation and land use is integrated in form-based codes, because they think about the space. Form-based codes focus on the space between the building and emphasize walkability and mix of uses. Form-based codes tend to do that more than conventional codes that seek to segregate uses, which ultimately drives sprawl. Does that answer your question? Hopefully.
That was great. Yes, thank you very much. I want to make sure we do have time still to talk about the upcoming events for Desegregate Connecticut. We've got, and also as I'm doing this, if anyone wants to continue to put in a few messages, questions into the chat, please do. And if we have time, we will certainly address them. Coming up on the 9th of November, we have Be the Change, a workshop for advocates. This looks like a really great thing that I want to make sure lots of people get out to. Desegregate Connecticut has been such a leader in making effective change in Connecticut, and so they're the people who know. And research on transit-oriented communities is coming up on the 11th. Well, there's just a lot of activity and a lot of great programming here. So please tune in if you can. The registration is at desegregate.ct/events. And does anyone else have another question? Sarah says this has been a wonderful panel. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for hosting this event. Thank you for sponsoring Park New Haven Parking Authority, and the Transport Hartford Academy at the, sorry, I can never remember the name of the Center for Latino Progress. Apologies, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
Thanks, everyone.